Alright, well I've put some graphite powder in there, worked it in well, blown away all the loose graphite quite carefully, and the action is now nice and smooth. Of course you can't feel it, but I certainly can, and I'm quite happy with the way that feels now. What it will mean is that the graphite has managed to pick up on some high spots that were previously rubbing, and providing some lubrication at those points, I'd say. It certainly works well. Looks good too, which is a bonus. There's a limited amount you can do to clean diaphragm blades, as I said earlier, because it's difficult to polish them as you would do with shutter blades, because they have the pivots sticking up which catch on your polishing cloth and cause big problems. So that's good, that's my outer case done. Those 3 screws are tightened down. The outer case can be popped to one side for the moment, and I can assemble the mechanism plate. I have to be careful here because I've got the mortal remains of some parts cameras lying on the bench, or shutters. Here's my mechanism plate. That's all clean. Here we have the lens tube, and we've cleaned that too. The bracket for the spring and the 3 screws that hold that all together. The other 2 of which are hiding. It's not uncommon. This piece, the blade actuating ring, the piece that swings the blades in and out, that's been replaced because the original was very ugly, very rusty, and unfit for further use. Dropping that into place, making sure it's not trapped under anything. Swing this detent spring into place. I'll check the action of that detent spring once the plate is assembled. If there's any roughness there, it would mean that the actuating ring would not move smoothly, and therefore the shutter would not be running as well as it should do. It's in correct position. There we go. I'm just holding this together with my finger, just checking that that blade actuating ring moves backwards and forwards smoothly, which it does, and put that bracket on there for the main drive spring. Pop its fixing screw in place. Run that up. Check that that's all running smoothly, and it is. So now it's got to find those other 2 screws. Here they are. Check that nothing's trapped under there. I'll do those 3 screws up snug. And I'll check that action again. It feels nice and smooth. Well, I'll lubricate that with a little bit of graphite powder. Again, I'll blow all the excess graphite powder out after I've worked it in well. And then we can flip this over, put the blades in, put the outer case over it, and then put the fixing screws in. If you're hearing a lot of background noise in the video, it's because I've got two computers running in this room. I've turned off the heat pump in your honour, so at least you haven't got that noise. And it's not windy, so there's no noise from the wind from outside. Alright, that all looks good. Let's just swing that ring into place at this position. That's where the shutter blades are fully open. And I should have 5 cleaned and polished shutter blades ready to go on there. If I can just encourage them out of my container. Three of these are original shutter blades. 2 of them are from my spares. That looks good. I can lower the outer case into position. Lining the holes carefully. Just check that they are lined up. That looks good. Three countersunk screws, flathead screws. When these 3 screws are in position, then the case and the blades are contained and nothing will get away. Checking that the blades do indeed swing open and shut with no obvious impediment. That looks good. A touch of molybdenum lubricant would be good. First, on the little detent spring, at the 2 points on the blade actuating ring where the main drive cam picks it up and shifts it backwards and forwards. On that surface, where it flips that lever out of the way. And one other point down here, and here where the B lever drop in. Unlike the shutters on the Retina IIIC and earlier cameras, the Contour Rapids and early Synchro Contours, there is no return spring on the mechanism plate itself to close the blades. All that action is done by the main drive cam. That looks good. There's a tiny spring has to go on at this point, and that's always a little bit awkward, but I'll attempt to do it without blocking the camera view too much. That's it. It returns that lever and this lever. Checking that it's seated in place correctly. It appears to be. That's all good. Now my video camera is telling me that the battery is running down. I suppose that may or may not be true. But I'd better investigate, so I shall stop recording at this point, change my battery and come back. Okay, well that's all sitting in place. I can set the B lever in position now. And its return spring. So I will swing my blades into the open position. At the end of the stroke, that allows the B lever to drop down into the past that tab, and that allows me to get my spring and everything into position easily. This spring is a combined spring on this model of shutter. It's pretty awkward to get into position. I've got that screw started but not tightened down. And this spring has to be on this side of the lever. Just checking that the screw is correctly seated, that the shoulder on the screw is guiding the B lever, and it is, that this return spring's in the correct position. Hold the B lever back, swing the shutter blades back to the closed position. I'm having fun with this video camera because although I've got 4 batteries, they all seem to be flat at the same time. we'll see how we go. A little bit of molybdenum on that surface, a little bit of molybdenum on that detent spring there, and fit this lever in place, making sure that the pin on the lever goes correctly behind that spring. It's just catching on it. I'll just swing that spring across. That's better. That lever's sitting down and correctly in position. This spacer, this shim, this is one from my parts. The original was rusted and ugly. It just feels a little bit rough there. What's going on there? Investigate that once this is in place. That feels smooth enough. And that's retained by 3 screws. Let's lift this retainer ring off. Can't get to my screws. It's popped off its post. Let's get that retainer ring off. I can see what I'm doing. That was only on there because we were checking the thread earlier. Right, let's get this back in position. Spring correctly seated, that's good. Shim correctly positioned. There's a cutout, it only goes in one position. The setting lever correctly in position over the post. First of the 3 screws in place. You see any of this? Yeah, just about. So that moves smoothly. Find the 2 mates for that screw and pop them in place. And the last remaining one here. Check that those screws are done up snug, and check that the aperture moves smoothly. It does. There's a little bit of friction there. Frequently you get a bit of friction where this ring runs around the body here and under those screw heads which hold it down. There will be a certain amount of distortion on this lever just because people have pulled and pushed at the settings tab. It's enough to provide a bit of distortion. So typically I put a little bit of graphite powder either side of those screw heads where it's held down. Then work the ring backwards and forwards, which will work in any graphite powder into that space, and if there's any high friction spots at that point, graphite powder will deal with it. That all feels good, so now I'll just go and blow that graphite powder away and carry on with assembling the components on the mechanism plate on the inside of the shutter. Well, I can carry on reassembling the mechanism plate now. All the stuff from the back's been done, so now we've just got to put the works back on here. So I'll start with this little gear. That's the pallet wheel. That's for the flash sink. A little bit of molybdenum on here. Drop this lever in place. Swing it round and fit its spring. Or at least that was the intention. Oh yes, there it is. It did its best to get away, but it was not successful. Check the action, make it sure it catches in smoothly and releases smoothly. Little tiny bit of molybdenum on that tab. Yes, that's good. Assemble the rest of these components. Check that that's seated down in place. Have flash contact, the moving flash contact. That's good. Just set that to take the pressure off that component. Fit the screw at this end. Fit the return spring and screw at the other end. I can get the spring to cooperate and lie down in the correct orientation so I can pick it up. Check that that spring is free underneath that screw head, hasn't been trapped. That looks good. Now swing the loose end of the spring back behind the lever. It drops into a notch. You can see that drops neatly into place. run a bit of molybdenum paste down that surface. That's where it traps the main drive cam in position when the shutter is cocked. I can pop my shutter release lever in place. Making sure that it catches down underneath the B lever there, and tuck its return spring down into the case at the top. And you can see how that lifts this lever out of the way. Just checking the action of the B lever to see that it drops in correctly, and it does. And I'm watching the position of my flash contact to make sure that the flash contact makes contact before the B lever can drop into place, and it does. Just looking for flex on that flash contact there as I move this across. That tells me that I've got physical contact of the flash contacts, and if you've got physical contact, you've probably got electrical contact. It would be extremely rare to find that there was some problem there. We have our main drive cam, and it's the main drive spring. There are certain surfaces I want to have molybdenum paste on. Certainly that curved surface there that runs against the retard gear train, and the surfaces here pick up the blade actuating ring and rotate it, so they just need to be low friction areas. I'll swing that round into the rest position, checking my mainspring to make sure it looks in good condition. And good condition means that it's isn't too slack. It's a if the shutter had been left in the cocked position for a long time, and that can be decades of course with an old camera, then the spring loses some of its impetus. When the cameras were somewhat current, a full shutter overhaul would always include replacing the main drive spring with a new one. But of course, main drive springs are somewhat thin on the ground at this late date, so it's often a case of finding the best one that's available to do the job. That looks very good. That shutter's working fine there. And what I need to do next is clean up the retard gear train and the self timer, lubricate them with some graphite powder, blow all that any excess graphite powder out, and then fit them to the shutter. Now I've had those two components sitting in a little jar of naphtha overnight. They were working relatively smoothly. I'm about to transfer them to the ultrasonic cleaner and let that give them a good blast, because there were obvious corrosion products in both the self timer and the retard gear train, and any of those loose corrosion products sitting on those surfaces, the ultrasonic cleaner will blow them away so that I can start off nice and clean.